Hey guys, welcome to another exciting episode of Reactor. I believe it is number 3. It's been a fair bit since I've made any videos for my YouTube channel, probably a few years actually, since I've been kind of busy with work at Digital Clips and Other Ocean and life and other responsibilities that have taken up most of my time. So I've kind of got the creative bug a little bit recently, and I want to start making some more videos again. I'm trying to figure out what exactly I should be focusing on and talking about that will A, interest people in general and want them to watch, and B, keep me interested in as well, since I'm just completely lazy, and unless something is fun and enjoyable, I'm probably not going to do it. So just being honest here. We'll see where that goes, and we'll see what other stuff I can come up with. Also, the other thing I want to apologize for is the quality of this video. I am just using a Microsoft webcam right now, and it's not the best. So normally I'd be using a different camera. That's not available right now, so I'm having to rely on this, but I thought it'd be okay given it's just a short video and it's not a big deal. So, what is the topic for this third reactor? Well, obviously it is the big news from yesterday where Sony basically announced the next console from them. And the strange aspect, the first thing I kind of want to talk about is that there wasn't a big streaming show of any kind. There was no major outlet covering this on the internet or on video or on TV or anything. It was kind of strange. They kind of snuck this message out with a Wired article and then a PlayStation blog article. I find this really weird because they had a state of play just a little while ago that they could have completely surprised people and unveiled this. And I'm shocked that they didn't, because they already had the eyeballs for it. So there must be a particular reason for this. I'm not sure what it is. I'm not going to guess what it is, but corporations, and especially Sony with many regions, knowing how those things are, it could be a million reasons why the announcement came out in the way that it did. But regardless, there is some great information that came out, and I wanted to go over it with you guys and kind of share my thoughts on that. So firstly, of course, right off the bat, it's the PlayStation 5. That comes as no surprise, I think, to anyone. I think Sony, especially being a Japanese-based company, is going to stick with what works. And, PlayStation, with a number, has worked for them over the last 4 generations, so it makes complete sense that this will be called PlayStation 5. I would love for them to, in the future, maybe base the name of the system around some new innovative components that comprise the system. But obviously, with PlayStation 5, the components that they're really focusing on aren't individually major enough to call the PlayStation something else completely different. So PlayStation 5 makes sense. It's the next evolution of the console. It's going to be somewhat similar to the PlayStation 4 at a core level, and so it makes sense just to have an increase in the number. So that's the name. So that's been confirmed. Second thing, which also shouldn't come as a surprise for most people, is that it's launching next year, holiday 2020, and that makes complete sense. It's going to go straight up against Microsoft next year with their Project Scarlet. I assume they're going to announce the name of that console next year. I don't think they'll wait till E3, but certainly probably not until next year. Which is kind of exciting because having 2 consoles launch at the same time, I feel, helps both consoles. Yes, there is competition, and yes, most people are not going to buy both consoles, but there's just so much news and so much build-up from a marketing and messaging perspective from both companies that the whole world is going to know that the next generation of consoles has started. And both Microsoft and Sony are there right at the get-go. So that's going to be kind of cool. I think you're going to see a lot more stories about it. I think you're going to see a lot more sort of worldwide interests. I think you're going to see a lot of like non-video game outlets covering these systems next year, because there's just going to be so much news and money spent on marketing and publicizing these consoles between Microsoft and Sony. So next year it's going to be all about PlayStation, all about whatever the next Xbox is going to be called. So PlayStation 5 launches holiday 2020. So let's dig into some of the individual components that got revealed as well. Some of this I'm taking from the Wired article, and then obviously some of it is being taken from the much shorter PlayStation blog entry that Jim Ryan, who's the president CEO of SIE, kind of wrote. And it's considering the announcement, it's a rather short blog entry, but regardless, main things that they kind of go over are the controller, some information about sort of the ray tracing, which is the next big buzzword, right, across video cards and consoles this next generation. We're talking about haptic feedback, and we're talking about high-speed drives, right, SSDs, which are going to make some significant changes in how games are done. And then another aspect that Wired brought up was, and they kind of talked about this loosely, but the idea of compartmentalizing games so that, you know, on the PlayStation 5, if, for example, a Call of Duty gets released, there's a multiplayer component to Call of Duty, there's a single-player component to Call of Duty, and the idea is you play the story mode, you're done with it, you can delete that part of the game from the hard drive and just leave the multiplayer side of that. And we'll go into that in a little bit at the tail end of this video, because I want to go through these in sort of a bit of an order. So definitely some exciting stuff. So let's start at the kind of the very beginning, which is the next DualShock, seemingly called the DualShock 5. The big thing about the DualShock 5 now is that, well, it looks very similar to the DualShock 4, which certainly comes, again, as no surprise. I'm sure the big thing about PlayStation 5 is that it's going to play all the PlayStation 4 stuff. It's going to support all the PlayStation 4 peripherals, controllers, VR, everything like that. So in that regard, you can't change up the controller too much. It's going to have the touchpad. It's going to have the same amount of buttons at least, if not more. And the configuration of it has to be kind of similar to the DualShock 4. So, on top of that, the big thing that they're pushing is sort of this haptic feedback, and that's going to replace the traditional rumble that Sony has used in their controllers and Microsoft has used in their controllers for the last many generations, ever since the original dual analog controller. And basically it's a spinning weight, a small one and a larger size one that spins in order to create a vibration in the controller. And there's some control over that as far as how you mix the speed of those things and the intensity of it to give you some semblance of sort of feedback. But haptic is a whole other thing, right? The amount of finite control you have over stuff, the amount of flexibility you have over stuff is considerably larger as far as a developer perspective. And I do want to say this first off as a caveat to all this. I have not seen a PlayStation 5 development kit. I have not messed around with one yet at all. So all these sort of things that I'm saying are purely my opinion. Obviously speaking from a game developer perspective, but I certainly don't have any insider information right now in relation to that console or what Sony plans to do with that console. So, haptic feedback. So basically, in a nutshell, it's going to allow you, as you hold the controller, to feel a lot more variation in feedback across a myriad of intensities. So, as they're saying in the PlayStation blog, you can tell the difference between crashing into a wall, which is a high-speed, major impact, versus, say, a tackle on a football field, which is still hard, but certainly not to level at a high speed impact from a racing car ramming into a wall feels like. They even talk about very specific examples and very finer detail examples of things like being able to sort of feel the sensation of textures of running through fields of grass or through mud and things like that. So how that's conveyed to the player is going to be interesting. I'm really curious about the technology inside the controllers and what sort of degree of freedom it provides to the development teams. But certainly the examples that they give already are kind of amazing, and will certainly do a lot for the user experience right in these games. Being able to feel going through certain different types of environments is going to be very amazing and certainly more immersive for this stuff. I mean, after all, there's only so many polygons you can throw at a screen, so you have to look for other innovations elsewhere and other ways to enhance the user experience elsewhere, and the controller is certainly one of those key things. So building upon the haptic feedback now, they've mentioned that the trigger buttons, so L2 and R2, are going to have adjustable levels of resistance. So obviously in the past controllers, there is a spring on that, and it has sort of a resistance, but it's consistent. There's the same amount of pressure to pull the trigger versus a bow and arrow or anything like that is exactly the same. There's no adjustment on that stuff. So what they're saying now is that developers can adjust the resistance of those triggers so that there's more pressure or more force that's required for something like pulling back a bow and arrow versus something a little bit more basic and simple. So that is certainly interesting. My only concern about that is hopefully, and this is only because I play a lot of first-person shooters like Destiny on the PlayStation 4, but I'm always breaking that R2 trigger, and that's because the button has two plastic pins, and oftentimes the pins on one side will bust off and you get a lopsided, R2 button, and I replace so many R2 buttons. So if they're actually doubling down and putting even more technology into those triggers, I hope and cross my fingers that they're going to have some sort of metal metal brace or metal bar in there to help reinforce that, so that we don't get a lot of busted trigger buttons. So we'll see how that goes, but hopefully they learned their lesson from the DualShock 4 and is improving upon that. So we got haptic feedback, which is going to be amazing. You've got now trigger buttons with varying levels of resistance, which is also pretty awesome. And then moving on, we've got a little bit more mentions of the SSD, right? The high-speed SSD and how that's going to impact a lot of things. We're going to have a lot more instantaneous loading, right? And we're going to have a lot faster installs from disk to hard drive. So hopefully it harkens back to the cartridge days a bit. It's never going to be exactly that, because the amount of data that we're having to push, every second is still quite high, but it should be a huge difference and allow for a larger variety of things than the traditional solid, original platter-based hard drive that's in the PlayStation 4 now. So that's going to be amazing. And you guys have already seen those Spider-Man demos and other things that Sony have done in the past, kind of showing the speed of which the SSD works and how it's going to allow for faster motion in games, faster loading in general, etc., etc. So I won't go into that too far. But I think it's great. I think SSDs are an amazing thing. I am excited to try and think about ways that we can incorporate that instant access in games and what we can do to make the experience more engaging and even better for players. So there's that. Oh, before I forget, one thing that they did say, which was neat, is that the medium, the format, the disc format that will be used for the PlayStation 5, which is still going to be Blu-ray based, but it's going to be 100 gigabyte discs. So as you know, the the current disc max is 50 gigabytes, and there's 25 as well, but 50 is sort of the max. And now Sony is doubling that to 100 gigabytes, which is kind of staggering if you think about it. Like, I can't even imagine the amount of work from an art perspective and data perspective is going to need to be created in order to fit 100 gigabytes of space. So we'll see. It'll be kind of cool to have that extra space, but I've never needed that for any game I've ever worked on. But certainly big scale third-person and first-person adventure games certainly will utilize that extra space for higher quality textures and a variety of other things, higher quality audio, etc., etc. So that's great. Next thing is something that I've been thinking about a little bit, and I'm trying to figure out sort of the use cases for it. It's that idea where Sony will be able to give developers the ability to kind of, well, I'm sure there's going to be a fair amount of work on the development side for this, but basically splitting up games into chunks or bundles that are separate from each other, so that users could theoretically erase or delete parts of a game, but not all of it. So the example I gave at the beginning, such as Call of Duty, the multiplayer and the single player, you go in, you play the single player, you're done with that, you're not going to play that anymore, get rid of that so that you can have the hard drive space reclaimed and just keep the multiplayer component on there. But there's a lot of issues with that, including the aspect that normally there's a lot of textures and code and audio and a myriad of other things that are used across all modes of a game, even Call of Duty. Now, I'm 100% sure that a lot of the stuff, or at least a good chunk of the components in the single player experience, are also utilized in the multiplayer experience. And whether it's textures, character models, sound effects, anything, there's going to be some overlap. So in that case, then, what is the developer going to do? Are they going to have to further duplicate assets, which wouldn't be a huge deal since you have 100 gigabytes of space on the disk, but you're now having to duplicate assets again across different modes, and in order to ensure that if one mode is deleted, that the other one still functions properly, etc. And like I said, at its core, I think that's an interesting idea. It'll just be interesting to see how easy it will be for developers to be able to do that. If there's an intelligent sort of bundling system that we can utilize, or if it's just the classic case of doubling up on everything, and there'll be like a multiplayer game with an executable and a single player kind of game with an executable, and they're almost treated separately. I guess the classic way I could explain it is that Sony has released, specifically on the PS3 and I think on some PS4 stuff, collections of games, and when you put the disc in the system, there's actually multiple executables, one for each game, and when you click on it, then it installs that game. So I can imagine the idea is very similar, that basically when you run the multiplayer mode, you're executing into a separate multiplayer kind of game that's sort of standalone by itself, and that's how that stuff would be handled. So, kind of cool. Certainly not, groundbreaking or anything like that, but it's, coming from me and especially other people who have to always kind of delete games on their hard drives because they fill up so often, being able to remove parts of a game once you're done with it or don't need it, or don't want to play it is kind of pretty awesome. Let's see. That's more SSD stuff. Sorry, I'm just kind of scrolling through the Wired article to see if there's anything else I can miss, or if I missed anything else. Controller will have an improved speaker, which is great, because I think that the games that utilize the speaker on the DualShock 4 were pretty neat. Like, you didn't get it that often, but the games that did do that were, felt a little bit special, and it was pretty neat. So I'm hoping that with the improved speaker and ease of being able to utilize that speaker, you'll see a lot more games using it for interesting and clever ways. More about the haptic feedback, feeling the difference between a machine gun and a shotgun, for example. And they're saying that they're using voice coil actuators in the left and right grips of the controller, so that's how they're doing the haptic feedback versus the rumble motors that were used in the past generations. So that's cool. I think that is the main stuff. I won't go too much into the ray tracing. Ray tracing is going to allow for some amazing stuff this generation, and you already see it in the NVIDIA cards. That's a big thing that they're pushing their high-end cards, and so it makes sense that the Xbox and the PlayStation are going to utilize that. And I think the only other last tidbit that came out of it was that the president of Blue Point Games, which were the development team that made the remake of Shadow of the Colossus, which is one of my favorite games of all time, basically, they're working on something, a remake, I guess, of some sort, but they're not talking about anything like that, so it'll be kind of cool. I do like the fact that he's saying that, as I said, we're kind of going back to the cartridge days. Games used to load instantly, and we're kind of going back now to that point with SSDs. So that's really exciting. So overall, I'm really excited about the PlayStation 5. I've been a very strong supporter of Sony and the PlayStation ever since the original PlayStation came out. I've got all the systems. I love playing on the PlayStation. It's one of my favorite consoles for sure. It's my go-to generally for multiplayer games and playing with my friends. So I'm excited to see what Sony delivers to us, not only from a fan perspective, but from a developer perspective as well. I'm excited to get my hands on the systems and see what sort of ideas we can come up with in order to push games to that next level. But I guess that's it. Let me know what you guys think about the PlayStation 5 announcement, what you're excited about, what feature you're most eagerly looking forward to learning more about. And all I can say is that this next year leading up to holiday is going to be very, very exciting. You're going to have announcements back and forth between Microsoft and Sony. And I can't wait to see how the competition plays out. I do love that friendly competition. I've said it before. I play all the systems. I love all the systems, but there's just something intrinsically awesome about two big corporations like Microsoft and Sony battling it out and trying to kind of show gamers why they should choose one console over the other. I think it's just kind of fun. I think it's great, and I think it helps overall to just boost interest in video games and spread word about the industry, further out to the fringes of the world. So, yep, that's all I've got today. Looking forward to more announcements from Microsoft and Sony. I'll try to talk about them as well as they come out. But let me know your thoughts, and I'll see you next time. Have a good one, guys. Bye.